Hello everyone, and welcome to the fire panel discussion for today. Glad to have with us an excellent panel here, all contributors to the book, and very glad to be answering questions coming in from live streams. We're live streaming it to the Sapphire offices in Reading, and later on in the day will be live streamed over to the Sapphire showroom in Canada as well. But if anyone wishes to ask a question, you can shout out appropriate points, or otherwise you can log on to sli.do. That's Slido, sli.do, and there's an event code there. You can join. The event code number is 537970. That's sli.do, and the code 537970. So we'll start off perhaps with a round of introductions. Duncan, if you want to start for us, and we'll go from your side to my side.
Okay. Hello, my name's Duncan Alabaster. I'm the technical manager at Polyseam. We manufacture the Protector fire stock range. I've about 33 years in the passive fire protection industry, ranging from manufacturers to actually surveying post Grenfell, some of the high rise. And shortly I'll be joining Tenos Fire Engineering Consultants.
Hi, I'm Nada Dawood. I'm a director with Wintech Limited, facade consultancy. Some of you must be quite aware of it. We do a lot of facade consultancy jobs. We do expert witness, sustainability, and we're there when you need facade engineering advice.
Hi, I'm Nick Coombe. I represent the National Fire Chiefs Council, the professional voice of the Fire and Rescue Service, and I head a team that's working with Home Office and what they're called now Deluxe, to see through the new regulations and obviously try and help with the remediation going on post Grenfell.
Morning all, I'm Jeff Wilkinson. I'm Managing Director of Wilkinson Construction Consultants. We are licensed approved inspectors. I've been working in building control in the public or private sector since the 1980s, and you may also know me as the building regs columnist in Architects Journal.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Russ Timpson. I'm a fire engineer. I also run the Tall Building Fire Safety Network, which has got about 1,600 members in 30 countries around the world. I'm one of those unicorns that's currently signing EWS1 forms. So there is one. I am one of those people doing that, and I'm formerly a firefighter.
Probably sitting in the wrong seat for that sort of thing. Anyway, my name's Nick Horton, head of marketing at Sapphire. Work at the front end of the business, presenting fire presentations, CPDs, and so on with architects at early stages. So we've got the first question, fairly generic, but perhaps Nick, if you want to start with this, is what can we learn from past fires in high-rise residential buildings, both from a positive and a negative point of view?
I think before I answer that, it's not just about fires. I think what we're not doing is learning from near misses. I think that's a bit we need to look at around our data, how we collect it and what we do with it. I think learning from past fires is obviously important, but that's a bit late, isn't it? And I think that's one of the messages we need to get out there, that there have been a number of near misses that we probably could have learnt more from. And NFCC are looking at how we can do that internationally as well as in this country. I think you have to learn. We're not going to stop fires. We're all here to try and make people safe, but fires will happen. And I think, again, and they'll be changing because of new technology, things like alternative fuels that are coming out. So we're always trying to keep pace with what's happening out there because of what's going on in the environment. But it is really important to learn lessons when we can. I think the inquiry has shown that we probably haven't done it as well as we should have done. I think that's something we've got to fix going forward.
Jeff, would you like to contribute some?
Yeah, I've got to agree completely with Nick. The issue is essentially that we haven't learned anything from any of the past. We're still continuing to make the same mistakes that we've always made, and we've still got the same culture that we've always had. And that's the thing that we fundamentally need to change. We've got to understand that most of these incidents are relatively low probability and high consequence, and we have that element that we need to address, but we also need to have the high probability, low consequence element to it as well. So it has to generate through not just these big issues and then address the big issues, we've got to address it in everything that we do day to day. It's got to become part of the culture. So it's one of the first thoughts that you actually have when you're putting pen to paper, and not how do I address this one specific issue, which is about this. Our focus has all been on cladding throughout the whole of this. Fantastic. But look at all the other issues. There's fire doors, there's fire stopping, there's all of these other issues within it. We're not addressing those. We're really focused on one issue for the past 3 years, and that's how we get the cladding sorted. If we'd actually sorted the means of escape routes and other bits out in the first instance, we might not have had this issue to begin with.
So why do you think we're not learning lessons from the past fires?
Because on a day-to-day basis, I still see exactly the same things happening, exactly the same culture, exactly the same way of driving down everything to the minimum possible standard. The first question we're always asked within building control is, well, what can we effectively get away with doing? It's not a culture of how can I present the best possible building, the best possible outcome for this. And until we get to the stage where we've got an NCAP rating for buildings and we actually start selling the value of that, I know Russ has done quite a bit of work on something called Firemark to try and get this through so that buildings are actually rated by that. Until we see that concept of value in fire safety in particular, and generally in safety, because it's not just fire, it relates back to structural safety, environmental, all of these issues that you'll hear throughout the whole of today. All of those things have got to be taken into account at the beginning of the project and not just left to a reaction to some global disaster.
Russ, natural lead in for you there.
Thanks. So I think the question was, what can we learn, good and bad? I think let's think about good. You know, billions of people live in tall buildings around the world every day, and nothing happens. And they are stunningly nice places to live in some of the. And you know, the World Health Organization has said by 2050, more of us will be living in cities than living in the rural environment around the world. So we're going to build many more tall buildings. In fact, I'm a member of the Council for Tall Buildings. There's going to be a city in China now with a definable boundary with 100 million residents in it, in one city. I've worked in Sao Paulo, 32 million, Lagos, 29 million. So these mega cities are just forests of tall buildings. Okay, so that's the direction of travel. That's where we're going, and we're seeing lots of people moving in. And if you live in a tall building and it has all of the nice parts to it, which means you don't have to necessarily commute. There's some fantastic stuff. So we have to accept that's the direction of travel. We're going to live in cities with a lot more tall buildings, etc. What can we learn from historic? Well, if you go onto our website, www.tallbuildingfiresafety.com, we've got an archive of tall building fires on there with lots of notes and stuff you can look at. They are, as already stated by Nick, they are low probability events, but they're very high consequence. So if we look at the top 20 tall building fires, if I can call it that rather inappropriate way, that they're all around 100 fatalities. And people don't just die in the rims of origin, they die in means of escape. And there's some questions you have to ask about the management of the building. So we're all talking about the technicalities, we're talking about the standards, we're talking about construction elements, we're talking about facades, etc. One of the realities that I've come to terms with is we need to talk about the management component and all of that. You know, a drunk can drive a Volvo, deemed to be the safest car, all that kind of cliche stuff, but you can still have a drink and drive it. I could build you what I would regard as a very low combustibility building with all the bells and whistles on it. If you take the fire, just briefly for example, if you take the Address Hotel in Dubai, that caught fire on New Year's Eve, that was the top of the range. That was the Ferrari of tall buildings. That had all the bells and whistles you could ask for as far as a fire engineer is concerned. And yet it still caught fire. Why did it catch fire? Because there was a dirty kitchen extract system and there were wires run inappropriately around a kitchen extract system. And that's down to management. So good thing, we're going to build a lot more tall buildings. We have to make them inspiring, great places to live. That's the way we're going. I think we should decarbonise. We should build them out of wood. I'm a fire engineer and I think we should be building out of wood. I'm a pretty lone voice in the industry on saying that, by the way. But certainly we should be thinking about not just the building. It's not just about building buildings. They have to be managed and they have to be run. And we're talking about balconies today. So you can build brilliantly safe balconies, but if people start having barbecues and hubbly-bubbly pipes and pagodas and all that other crap that they put on them, then we've got an issue.
Really good point there. And that kind of leads us on to one of the questions which the audience seem to be liking in there, which perhaps, Nada, if we ask you this one first, is what practical steps need to be in place to reduce risk in early stage design?
I think collaboration is key, and that's something we have learned from the past as well. Where there have been failures, it's always been identified that the proper people weren't involved or they didn't have the proper conversations. And I think the most important point is what he said is the focus is not on delivering a building that is good for the tenants or good for the people, but it's delivering a building that meets all the criteria in terms of getting it signed off from, say, building control or the insurance providers. And I think the focus is still on that. It's not right, but it is the truth. So the focus needs to shift to delivering a building for the people and collaborating with the right set of people earlier on. So I think that's key. And I think all the construction professionals right now need to come together in the earlier stages and not at the end to try and make sure that this ride is smooth at the end. So the more work you put on earlier, it's better at the end, and you get a much better building.
Duncan, tell us a bit from your experiences approaching for manufacturing.
We're always the Cinderella trade, always called in at the end with our magic wand to try and actually come up with some magical scheme for upgrading fire resistance of walls and floors and cavity barriers for facades. I had a project recently in Ireland where I got everybody with early engagement around the table. So we had the M&E, we had the architects, we had the fire consultants, we had the builders, the drywall. And my first question was, whose responsibility is the fire stopping? And they went, oh, it's the subcontractor. I went, no, it's all of you. So buying in that cooperation between everybody minimized any later problems that can possibly arise through, services not being in the right place, with drywall not being built properly. And what's happened with that job, after a little bit of resistance with mechanical services, putting in service supports and things like that in the right places, it's worked perfectly, because actually they see it's a more efficient way of building it. It's actually long-term a lot cheaper because you're not looking for retrofit things. And the fire consultants can go in and they can actually tick a box. In addition to that, the records can then be transferred to the occupying the client, if you like, and then they can put in, I think as Ross said, with good housekeeping. They know where their barriers are, they know what to do, they know what the maintenance regime is, and it's keeping that good house building, because the building is a living entity which is changing continually. And I would be really surprised, even with the best building, if there aren't issues from my small perspective on fire stopping on a daily basis. They're being bashed about every day. So it's the housekeeping after that handover that's really important, and knowing how to maintain those important features.
It's a really interesting point you're making there. And the word early engagement can often, to some people in the industry, may actually mean that you're stitching yourself up with cost-wise, but you mentioned there about cost avoidance and so on. But we have the term value engineering. I think this might be what a few of you have perhaps alluded to, in kind of building it right in the first place, and successful examples of that may have come from that. But what are the panel's thoughts on that kind of early engagement versus the kind of value engineering approach at this now? I appreciate value engineering in real terms means cut costs, not value engineer. But Jeff, perhaps if you start on that.
Yeah, so possibly dragging into one of the other questions that you may be asking later, we have identified the fact that there really need to be like three gateways to this. The planning phase, the construction phase, and the occupation phase. So we're really talking about the planning phase and engaging and understanding what your strategy is at that earliest point. The number of times I've been involved from a building control perspective where a development has got through planning, it's got through to the point of starting to develop construction drawings on a scheme that fundamentally doesn't work. It just is impossible to build what you've got planning permission for, because it just doesn't comply in any name, way, shape or form. And it's those kind of mistakes that we're continuing to make by not engaging and understanding early on. Although we're predominantly talking today about high rise, one of my particular concerns at the moment is the move towards what I refer to as airspace development, where we're adding stories onto existing blocks. Before we even get to the planning application stage. We need to have looked at those buildings and seen whether they're even remotely suitable for adding these extra stories on, whether that's structurally and whether the existing staircases and the strategy for the existing building is actually acceptable, rather than doing a design for 2 extra stories on the top of that building. And we're still making those mistakes now. So that early engagement is absolutely fundamental if we're going to deliver anything like the number of houses that we need to do. Because let's not forget, we still need to be delivering houses for people. If we end up with a system that becomes so complex and so unwieldy that we're not delivering, we're failing on that side as well. So we need to have a common sense balance to all of this, and to make sure that we get that early engagement in, so that we get the right advice from the right people early on enough to avoid the cost cutting and stuff that goes on later on in the project.
So how do we move the industry from where we are today, Russ, to what we've been talking about here, towards this kind of thing which Nada and Duncan have been referring to?
Well, we have to rediscover some ethics, which is a new thing for some of the. I say this because I've seen it. When you come to a project, there's a fixation on capex, isn't there? And your value engineering, and the project director says, right, we've got to find some cost savings. So let's do an exercise. We're going to shave off 10%, whatever it is. And so that becomes the predominant feature, and everybody gets money orientated. And I say that. I was working with BAA when we built Terminal 5. Anybody's got the scars, we can have a join hands outside. Anybody who was part of that, we can have a survivors meeting. But value engineering was very much order of the day on several occasions, because the money was running out, and it was running into, as you probably know, £4 or £5 billion to build it. What we've got to do is stop having this fixation on capex. Projects have got to look at OPEX, the operational cost of running the building for 25 years. If you do that exercise, things like sprinklers, things like enhanced systems become almost inevitable that you're going to do that. Because if you've got a design and build CapEx, throw it up, get onto the next job, take the profit and go on to the next job, really you're not concerned about the longevity of that building. So there has to be a culture shift that says, actually, let's consider the amortization of the cost of that building over 25 years, insurance, flexibility, change of use, those kinds of things. If you do that, you're going to build a much higher quality building, because let's not forget that approved document B for England and Wales is only based on life safety. The bar is very low to build a building. And when I speak to tenants and other people, they're shocked, and they say, well, but this is a hospital, this is an airport, this is a school. Yeah, it's on life safety only. We've set the bar very low. If you want to set the bar higher to talk about resilience, and I think that's the term we have to start using now, how resilient is the building going to be? Can it suffer a compartment fire and still be used, for example? Are we going to decant 80 families out of this block because we've had a chip pan fire in the kitchen? Well, at the moment, probably yes, you will, with all the inherent costs that go with that. So I think we're seeing that the new flex competency standards that's coming out with the Building Safety Bill, all of those competency requirements are wrapped around by ethics and culture. And we have to move away from a CapEx culture that allows value engineering to come in and take place. Because you're going to have to be questioned on this in the future, why you took out certain features, or why you reduced fire resistance, and why you did certain things. So I think we have to transition from CapEx to OPEX, and some great work by a guy who's passed away now, a guy called Ramachandran, who did great work on actually developing those costs, certainly for fire safety. And I would say, you should be looking at that building you're building and thinking about the cost for the life of the building as a minimum 25 years.
So, interesting point. There's a couple of questions which come in from the audience which relate to this. There's one around encouraging a marriage of fire safety and energy efficiency. Obviously, we need doors, windows, balconies, all the external wall systems and so on. But also the directional move towards net zero. And there's also another question talking about greater focus on the management and maintenance of buildings, which kind of links in the same sort of category. But Nada, talk us through how we can encourage this kind of marriage between fire safety and energy efficiency.
It's always been done. There's not too much of focus on it as a marriage. It's being done in different stages for a vast number of years. The focus has been a lot on it more after Grenfell, understandably so. But there should be lot more focus on various other things apart from just fire and cladding, like you said. In terms of energy efficiency and materials, fortunately, unfortunately, ADB is written in such a way, and everyone in this industry is working in such a way that we need to meet the guidance of whatever classification we need to meet, A to B, depending on the type of building. Energy efficiency, we need a lot more work put into it in terms of materials, how we can design it, how we can use it. It's not just one industry. There's a lot of industries coming together. There's a lot of work to be done to try and balance energy efficiency and fire efficiency and meeting the performances. Because, for example, we have a lot of focus on achieving minimum U values, thermal performance, etc. But at the same time, there's another conversation that keeps happening, which is not at the forefront, is overheating in apartment buildings. So as we try and tighten all those, overheating fails. And then comfort cooling comes into place, which means it takes a hit in efficiency. So we need to start balancing all this and focus on everything equally so it all works in tandem. And unfortunately, right now, we're focusing too much on certain items or certain elements of the building. And I think we need to start looking at it holistically. And the good thing about panels like this is when different engineers come together, different disciplines come together, and everyone starts thinking on the same lines, it helps a lot more in the process.
Nick, what would you say from your experience in this kind of aspect?
I think at the moment it sounds like one of my previous marriages, if I'm honest. It's just not working at all. But I think that what she said is true. It's got to work together. But I think we're always pushing the boundaries on certain things, and the way energy efficient is upgraded sometimes. If you look at the approved documents about how you have to go to the best in that, whereas in fire safety we have this thing called the non-worsening condition, which is a farce. Jeff spoke about we've had one come into London where they've put 2 extra floors on a building, takes it over the now new 11-metre rule for sprinklers. We're not sprinkling the previous floors because it's no worse than it was. We'll sprinkle them top 2 floors, but we're not doing the rest of the building. And that's the attitude we've got to change. And non-worsening needs to be looked at a lot more. Whereas if you were to upgrade it and use Part L, then you have to go to the best stuff. You can't say, well, it's no worse than it was. It's not allowed. So it's this whole coming together of the standards. They don't link together. They are seen to be. When I was taught about them, A, structure can't fall down, B, can't burn down, and they went in that kind of order. I think that's wrong in a sense because they're all in a sense important, but there is no joined up thinking, I don't think. And this is where collaboration. The problem with collaboration as well, though, is that the project moves, doesn't it? You can all sit around in the design team and go, yeah, we're going to do this. Halfway through the project, money comes into it, and then you're doing this bit and you're changing. So all the good work is sometimes undermined. And I think that, the project needs to be, and the collaboration team need to see it all the way through. I'm sure Russ and Jeff know about fire engineers who are brought in either too late or they're brought in the beginning and then they're dismissed off the project and then they're no longer consulted on. I mean, that kind of happened at Grenfell. If you look, how they built a fire engineer for a certain bit, then didn't want him anymore, her anymore, and therefore they didn't do their job for real. So I think you've got to see it as a longevity project, that a team of just no one knows everything. That's the bit. And that collaboration through the whole lifetime of the project. And again, what Russ says is, I think there's more concern of getting it up and getting it done than how it's going to be lived, used, worked for the following 25, 50, 100 years it's here. I mean, you only have to look out there as our London chair. I started my fire career in Old Kent Road in 1980, and, it didn't look anything like this then. And that's what we've got to deal with. We're going to have this changing landscape, and we've got to be ready for it. And I don't think we are.
Interestingly, 18-metre mark, the magical number, which we certainly from a balcony point of view get asked about it a lot. I know our sister company do as well, Midec. We get quite often asked the question, should it be different underneath 18 metres? Our approach is no. The thinking of residents in a building below 17 metres or below is no different to what it is at 18. But what was the general panel's thoughts on that? What do you think, Duncan?
I think if you want to make a building as safe as possible and as functional as possible, so if it's good enough for something above 17 or 18 meters, you should apply that all the way down. You know, that's my. I'm not a specialist on this, but it seems to me you want to. It's life safety, so you need to aim for the top of the chart, not the bottom. Something I come across quite often is that, not particularly with balconies, but people are more interested. Builders are more interested about air tightness and acoustics because they have to test for it, but you can't test for fire resistance. And you know, we should be aiming at the top of the tree, not sort of middle, just because a building's small, not as tall as other ones.
Russ, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on something to that. The above 18 and below 18 is open to a lot of interpretation in the industry. So we do have a lot of fire engineers who say you can use something different below 18, and above 18 you need to be A2 in the same building. You have some fire engineers who come back and say it has to be the same, and some who come back and say the fire strategy says otherwise. So it's open to a lot of interpretation, and I think that's a big problem in the industry. So unless that gets sorted out, I think we still have to look at it on a project-by-project basis.
Sure, and there was a advice note, wasn't there, which came out clarifying about fire spread on the outside of buildings following a fire in Northumberland. But perhaps come back to you in a second on this, Russ. But if anyone's in the audience has got a question, be glad to take it if they haven't added it to Slido already. Anyone got a particular question? Go for it, Ken.
I'd like to hear more about the suggestion to build tall buildings in timber.
So there's been some great work done in Canada on tall timber. The concrete and steel accounts for about 7% of global CO2 emissions. So if we're going to look at the main reasons why, you know, and certainly in the time of COP26, you know, there are some compelling arguments about building out timber. You sequestrate CO into there, you use the right type of trees, fast growth trees, which you can then put into various different types of forms, CLT systems, etc., etc. The issue for me, surprisingly, is fire is not the biggest hazard to tall timber buildings. It's water. Uncontrolled releases of water into a timber building is a real problem because obviously it gets into the wood, etc. As far as I'm concerned, if the building's managed well, you can build it out of what you want. And if you've got appropriate systems in there, I see no reason why we shouldn't build with tall timber. Tall timber is dangerous and hazardous when it's being constructed. If it's been constructed properly afterwards, there's no reason why it can't. I don't think you can draw comparisons with any other material. And the arguments about concrete and steel are compelling. And you know, there's lots of mythology about steel. That steel is, you know, steel is non-combustible. It doesn't burn. Steel is actually pretty bad in fire. It melts. It loses 2/3 of its strength at about 575, which is pretty low temperature in a compartment fire. It goes like plasticine. I've seen buildings where the steel is just all drooped on the floor after it's been involved in a serious fire. So I think there's a lot of perceptions and a lot of misunderstandings about tall timber. Certainly some of the work that's being done in Norway, I think that we've got the tallest timber building now is 55 floors. There's certain tall timber buildings going up in Japan. So my appeal to the fire industry is don't be naysayers, get on board, because I can tell you, engaging with the Council for Tall Buildings, it's coming. Tall timber is coming. Sure as not, you know, sure as I can be, we are going to build buildings out of timber. So from the fire, I'm asking my fire colleagues to get on board, because we can stand shaking our heads and say, no, that's terrible, it shouldn't happen. And there will be fires, by the way, there will be fires. But there's been fires anyway. I think some of the rationale in terms of carbon reduction is compelling. Is that the answer to the question?
Supports my own argument as well. I run webinars for the supply chain school about DFMA and different materials. And I would advocate timber first, if at all possible. But the disappointment is that the building regulations in this country preclude the use of timber above a certain height. And I think that needs to be reassessed.
I'd agree.
Nick, what would you think of this?
I kind of agree with Russ, but I think it's all down to about how they're built. I mean, he went on about if they're managed, and that's true, but it's how they're constructed as well, isn't they? You know, we all know that the construction trade have not got the greatest ethics going. You know, we decanted a building in North London, a modular construction, because basically when it was put together, you know, if any of you have ever buttoned your shirt up wrong and you go, oh, what's that? And that's how they built it. They put the bolts together, got to the top and realised, oh, we've got 2 extra holes here and I ain't got any bolts. You know, it's like me making IKEA furniture. You know, what's all this stuff left over, you know? And we can laugh, but that people had to leave their homes because of that, because of the structural stability was done. You know, the National Fire Chiefs Council are all for modern methods of construction because if done well and all the other benefits they got. I'm not convinced with the checks and balances that are going on in the construction industry, because when modern methods fail, they fail far worse than traditional. That's a fact. So for me, yes, build your super high timber buildings. I haven't got an issue as long as the checks and balances are done and the management is right. So we're not anti it. I just think I'm not sure that our construction industry. I don't know enough about other countries' construction industry, but what I've seen firsthand post Grenfell, I'm not. That's what worries me around how they're built. Not the concept. The concept is fine. Like a lot of concepts are fine. It's actual day-to-day of putting it together. And of course, it's the fire and rescue service who are the people who are going in when other people are coming out. So obviously, I'm all for firefighter safety, and I think we need to look at that. You know, what was mentioned about planning. The amount of times when they knock down a sports pavilion, build a block of flats and say, goes back to someone, well, the access is no worse. You know, it's no worse than it was. Yeah, but it was a sports pavilion now. You've now done a 40-storey block of flats. I need to get fire engines and people there as soon as possible. It's not good enough, you know, these concepts of, oh, it'll do all the time. I think the best thing Russ said is about morals and ethics. That's what we need. I don't think there's this range of incompetence that people have said. I think it's this about morals and ethics, about doing the right thing. I could look around this building and find how many times on a Friday evening before the guy what was going home did he think, oh, I'll leave them last 2 bolts out on these windows here. I want to get home. I need to get my train because I work up north. And that's the thing we've got to change in the industry. He isn't incompetent. He's just human. You know, we all cut corners when we're tired and all that kind of stuff. How we change that, I haven't got a magic wand, but it's really important about that. And then what you need is people checking it. That's the thing. Check, you know, there's not enough checks on what we do. There's not enough checks and balances. And enforcement. Sorry, I'll let somebody else go. I'm on a rant.
It's a brilliant topic. We've got a competency panel next, and no doubt this will be explored quite a lot in that. Just going back to the timber buildings for a second, I'll come on to you in a second, Jeff. Following one of the fires a couple of years ago, one of the leading insurance companies wrote a article about how MMC was a bad thing for fire safety. But I'm not sure what others, many of you probably seen that, but I don't. Jeff, tell us about that sort of side of things.
Okay, well, I'll start off with picking up some of the pile that there is there to unpack.
Yeah.
I think, first of all, we need to first unpack this discussion about timber being super sustainable. We don't have that timber in the UK. In the first instance, we can't build the buildings in the UK out of UK timber. So if you start looking at the carbon journey, then all of a sudden timber doesn't look quite as sustainable as you might think it actually does. So I think we've got to look at that. And the first thing that we really have to recognise is that the most carbon efficient building, the most green building is the one that already exists. If we're knocking it down, okay, and then rebuilding it, then we are contributing to the global climate crisis in the first instance. So yes, timber is better than certain other products, but let's look at its entire journey, because if we're bringing it from deforestation in Brazil, for example, that is very different to what we're talking about. If you're in Norway, you've actually got the spruce and stuff there to be able to perform it in the country of origin. So let's unpack that one as a start point. Secondly, on the subject of MMC, the important thing about traditional construction products is that we understand them. The biggest issue that we've got as we move forwards with any form of new technology coming in is that it needs to be robustly tested. And if we've got the robust testing, which is some of the stuff that's going on elsewhere, then we can start to rely on it, and then we can start to use it. So the whole point of building regulations traditionally was to act as a barrier to the innovation and make sure that we go through the process of thoroughly testing. So there's that element to it. In terms of the point that Nick's picking up, I think that there really is this fundamental issue of and I'm going to use the term competence because I can't think of anything else to really address it other than that, the competence of what's going on the ground. We're not going to get a culture change with the way that we're adopting this at the moment. We're talking about the only buildings that are going to come in within this new regime are buildings over 18 metres in height. That's nonsense. You don't get a culture change by picking 5,000 buildings across the UK. It's got to be in everything we do every day, from the smallest builders up. The UK construction industry is fundamentally formed by SME companies. The Shard may well have been built by one major developer, but in truth, there were thousands probably of SMEs that were actually involved in it. And we've got to get the message out to the SMEs. We also need to ensure that the SMEs are not put under pressure to have completed at the end of Friday, to have got that in, or they're under some kind of financial penalty to have got that done. How do we solve that in the future? I think the solution to the future is actually to incorporate BIM technology and artificial intelligence, so that at the end of the day, there's a laser scan that's gone around at the end of week 1 that's established whether or not you've actually got the right bolts in the right places. If we can get that kind of thought process into it, and we can start developing these new technologies and understanding, we are still building the way we built literally thousands of years ago. It didn't work then, it doesn't work now, and we've got to make sure that we're providing the kind of manufacturing that we've got in all of our other industries. You don't get halfway through building a Rolls Royce or even a little Fiesta or whatever and suddenly think to yourself, you know what, we're running out of cash on this, I'll strip these bits out. You know what, we won't stick in the airbags after all. That's not how we build anything else. Why in God's name are we doing that within construction? Construction is still in the dark ages, and we need to put that through. We saw earlier about the Lighthouse charity. That is the kind of pressure we're putting those operatives under to suddenly complete it. You are going to get people taking shortcuts or feeling under pressure and not having been paid because they haven't done this. That culture has to change from the very bottom, from Mrs. Miggins' domestic kitchen extension up to the Shard.
Some really good points there, Jeff, and it's perhaps the word of warning for everyone involved in the industry, especially now when we've got material shortages. I'll be extra pressure for the guys on site, but could be an opportunity for people to cut things or to avoid LEDs and other stuff. But Russ, well, one of the other questions we've got here, what regulation does an architect or specifier need to be aware of for firefighting and considerations in building high-rise buildings? It's quite easy to say all of them.
London Fire Brigade actually used to run a really fantastic training day. I don't know, Nick, if you remember this.
Yeah.
It was called the B5 training day, where they used to get architects and they bring them into the fire brigade training, so they put them in fire gear and they get them to run hoses upstairs and plug into wet risers and stuff. And I didn't actually witness it myself, but spoken to colleagues, and they said that the effect of that was at the end of the day, the architects would say, "I didn't realise, I didn't understand, I didn't." Now it's quite an architect trains for 7 years. Have we got any architects in the audience? Okay, how much of that 7 years did you spend on fire safety?
2 hours.
It's about an afternoon in 7 years, is my experience talking to architects.
The course Russ is talking about, when we'd say, okay, it's 18.5 metres, do I really need a firefighting lift? There's all the gear you've got to carry up. Off you go, get up them steps and carry it and see how you feel at the top of it. You know, it's only an extra couple of metres to the, now you've got to stick another length of hose between that and that. You see how difficult when it all gets curled up. The lobby area, can we just make it 1 metre square less because I want to put a nice bathroom en suite in there. Now you've got to get all this gear and you're working in a very tight environment and that. And it was a really good day that they did, and they did love it. And I'd like to do it again. Probably commercially, it would be something that people could run, because I think it gives them that real practicality. And it's not architects' thought. They're not firefighters, so they don't want to be firefighters. They want to earn real money.
They're in the wrong job as an architect then.
I don't know, but it is just to show that practical demonstration of what it really means. because one of my beefs is the old vertical pipe. So you can't get the appliance close enough. Oh no, we'll give you a nice vertical pipe to plug your hose in. I've still got to carry the ladder, all the BA and everything else. And, you know, it's changed a lot since I was a firefighter, because they now do ambulance stuff, you know, evac packs and all that kind of stuff. The gear they have to carry nowadays is horrendous. But if you show them that and practically show them how it is, I think it makes a difference. And I think, and again, we need to learn as firefighters, we need to learn more about how other people do their jobs as well. I don't think we know enough about building construction. Again, is something that's not taught a lot now to firefighters, you know, and so we need to learn how materials will behave in fires, how you know, roofs work, etc., etc. So there needs to be a cross-fertilisation of training, you know.
Can I ask another question?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry.
Can just by show of hands in the audience, how many of you understand what combustibility means? There's a few people tentative like that.
Yeah.
So limited combustibility. What does combustibility mean? And I can tell you, and this is not just a discussion for this country, it's a discussion around the world. The number of people in the building industry don't understand what combustibility means, because everybody says, "I want non-combustibility." But what does that mean? It doesn't ever catch fire. Doesn't catch fire. Doesn't react in fire. Concrete. Would we all agree that concrete is non-combustible? Would you agree with that statement? Concrete doesn't burn. Yeah, but concrete, when you expose it to fire, spalls, it explodes. And it completely it degenerates in fire. So go back to your question about architects. I think I would certainly, engaging with RIBA, I would certainly think that there is a space for more in the architect's competency around fire, and certainly that's the general direction of travel. There's some fundamentals. Whenever I've been engaged with architects, they more or less say, "Well, that's why I'm employing you. You tell us what we need to do, because, you know, really I've got the big picture, which is the shape, the form, you know, all that kind of stuff." So I think there's a meeting of minds here, and I think if we could do something like the B5 day, where you could just understand what it takes actually to do certain things, I think that would be a real benefit.
It's a great point. And building 18.5 meters was realistically 12 flights of stairs. It's quite a lot of running if you actually put in practical terms, isn't it? Hackett report and the whole the gateway process bound to come up, and we've got a question about in the implementation of the golden thread. What impacts on records and accountability for this? And I'll perhaps start off by mentioning Regulation 38 as well, because that's one which often will come up as a result of discussing this side of things. But Nada, perhaps start us off with the golden thread and some practical tips, perhaps, for the audience on what the likely implications are going to be.
We have read a lot about the golden thread. We know it's there in various news channels, but we are yet to see it in action and how it trickles down. It's still not quite clear in the industry on what it requires. We do know there are 3 stages in planning, then during construction, and then accountability at the end, which is the management of the building. And I think that has its whole lot of issues, because it's a dramatic shift from the way things are working now. So to be honest with you, all of the guidelines are there and all the people know about it. It's not been much in action as yet to be able to comment on it or to say it's right or wrong. I think we need to go through the process to understand it a bit more. There's a lot of focus on BIM, which is what you spoke about, and I think it's absolutely right. That's going to become a prerequisite as part of the Hackett, as part of the golden thread. It's quite important that it's there, and there's a lot of focus on it. There's a lot of focus on the planning stages on what needs to be done, but it still hasn't trickled down sufficiently enough to know what exactly is required, what's being done, and what is remaining to be done. So it's still a process everyone's going through. Everyone's still trying to understand it. I think we're all in the same boat.
Over it, Jeff.
Yeah, great. So Reg 38 plans are one of the most difficult things to actually obtain from a building control perspective. I was involved last week in undertaking a fire risk assessment on a building. I had no involvement from the building control perspective during the course of it. The building had a different layout. There was one less stair in the building than was on the original fire strategy. To my understanding, that building has not had a revised fire strategy and has effectively been presented and is ready to occupy. Now, that is the kind of stuff that's continuing to go on, and that's where the issues lie. That every stage within the process under the Hackett report will require you to have gone through a locked gateway. Okay, so you can't start on site until such time as you've got the fire strategy in place. You can't change that strategy and start building something else until you've got that revised layout agreed. Again, going back to other industries, you don't just bizarrely change the design of the Fiesta or whatever else it is halfway through the project. If you're going to do that, you go back and you robustly test against your original concepts whether or not what you're still doing still works. Okay, unless we can get that mindset in place, there's going to be a major issue. Now, on these high-rise buildings where we're within scope, we're going to have that. We're going to have an enforcement body that will at last have powers to turn around to someone and say, you're not building to the plan that you've submitted and agreed to us, stop now. We don't have those powers at the moment, okay? And we're only going to have those powers on 5,000 high-rise buildings, and most of those are already constructed. So it's going to be an even smaller number where we actually have it. And you can look out the window at the moment, you can see maybe half a dozen or so where you'd actually have the power to stop what's going on. Then, in terms of the ongoing engagement, if it's then not maintained, and as Russ was saying, the actual strategy is continued on after it, you're going to have some enforcement power. In my personal opinion, if we'd have just added that one bit to the existing regs that we already had, we wouldn't have needed to go through this entire process. We just needed to have those stages in place. We have a ridiculous scenario at the moment, particularly on the smaller scale projects, where we have something called a building notice, where effectively you make it up as you go along. Okay, you don't need to have a set of approved plans. You just literally decide, well, I feel I'm competent to do this work, I'll carry on and do it. We need to make sure that we have this approval process in place for each step. It's essentially a quality assurance process, and construction doesn't have a proper quality assurance process in place.
Russ.
Well, Dame Judith Hackett has said that all fire-related records need to be digitised by 2023, which is a big challenge for the construction industry and the management industry per se. Golden Thread, I know some about this because I've been teaching it, so hopefully I know a little bit about it. Perhaps I'll expose my incompetency now, I don't know. But you have to produce a thing called a safety case report for a higher risk building. That safety case report needs to be a fire risk assessment and structural safety assessment on steroids, really. It's been a transference from the petrochemical and the high hazard industries. So Golden Thread safety case is an interchangeable term. And you need to generate that information and that data in order to produce a safety case report. And from that, you'll get your building certificate, assurance certificate at the end of it. That's the whole thrust now, because we're seeing a lot more application of health and safety principles into the fire world than we've ever done before. I mean, as a fire professional, I was not familiar, or I didn't use a lot of the term reasonably practicable, and yet we're going to see the application of that coming into the fire world a lot more than we've ever done before, which means we're going to have these discussions about all those value engineering stuff, because it's going to come under a reasonably practicable argument. Now, we've not done that before, really. It's been quite binary in the fire world. Either it's approved or not approved. And yet we're going to have lots of discussions. And if I draw an analogy with BB100, the school standard, which in the back of it said, there's a rationale for whether or not you should fit sprinklers. Shock. We didn't fit any sprinklers in schools because we've done the value engineering exercise, and actually it's not cost effective to fit sprinklers in schools. So getting back to the answering of your question, Golden Thread is that continuum of an accumulated data, fire-related data, that you will need in order to produce that safety case report, in order to get your building certificate. Now, there is a draft standard out at the moment, BS 8644. I don't know if anybody's seen that standard. That's a draft standard for the management of fire safety information. So that is currently out and it's in draft, and hopefully that's going to come around. Now, that's the first British standard that's been commissioned to solve a problem rather than the other way around. So there is going to be guidance on that, but obviously the Building Safety Bill is about fire. It's also about structural safety. If we think about that block of flats that recently collapsed in how many building safety managers can spot concrete cancer, for example, in a building? So structural safety, fire safety, Golden Thread is interchangeable with the word safety case, and you're going to have to produce this safety case report, which the guidance is out now. If you go and Google it now, the HSE have produced the guidance on how you produce a safety case report. And that's really your key to understand what you're going to need from the golden thread. But ultimately, it's going to be BIM, it's going to be a central repository of data which you're going to have to populate. And that's the way that I believe, and this is my own opinion, that's the way the building safety regulator is going to look at the estate, if I can call the UK that, and it's going to say that's the way it's going to identify where it's going to do its work as a first instance. That's the direction of travel, in my opinion. In my opinion.
I think, yeah, Russ, I think explained it very eloquently there. And, and then you've got the issues. It's about 12,000 over 18-metre buildings we've got existing at the moment. And of course, some of them will be back from the 60s to recently built. And so having this golden thread for some of the older buildings can be very, very difficult when they do their safety case. And I think, there's going to be a small subset of new buildings. And my worry is that the way the industry is, apart from some of the bigger cities, you won't build a building over 18 metres because of the fact you're going to be under so much scrutiny by the new regulator. Then you've got the levy that you're going to have to pay as well. Why not build it below that? Then I can just carry on doing the shocking stuff I'm doing and I won't have that scrutiny. So that won't happen in London, obviously, because space is at a premium and you get the money for building taller and higher and the money for the flats. But some of the smaller cities and smaller places, I can see very few over 18-metre buildings because they won't make, normally they're only 10, 11 stories anyway, aren't they? So I'll just come down a bit and I'll cut my cloth accordingly on that. So that I think that's a negative side we'll see if we're not careful in certain places, that they'll use the fact I'm being scrutinised. I don't want to be scrutinised. As Jeff says, you've got this power now. It's not as it is. Stop building. That's a massive tool in the armoury, isn't it, really? So I think they'll try and a lot of them will say, I'm not building over 18 metres anymore.
I think we really need to, again, go wider than in-scope buildings. Ideally, we would have the gateways for all buildings, regardless of height, and that would be a great start. But let's not forget, as Russ was pointing out, this is not just about fire safety. This is about construction standards generally. This is what we're really talking about. We were talking earlier, someone said about all the focus on thermal performance. We've got massive problems because our buildings don't actually perform thermally as we presume that they do. There are gaps in the insulation, etc. So we need to have accurate records. Now, one of the things that I think people have missed in some of the consultations that have gone out on Part F and L are the requirement for more photographic records across all parts of the industry. Construction is going to grind to a halt if you've got to have building control come out and inspect all of these things. So it can't be that you've got this third-party inspectorate that comes out and signs you off to say, so construction has to take responsibility for its own shit, if you pardon the language, and actually start getting on top of what it's doing. Now, that means, say, accurate records of everything that it's doing. Now, to a degree, we have the technology in our hands at the moment. In order to be a registered installer or a competent person, I can have a digitized passport on my phone to say that I'm competent to do this. And I can take photo records of what it is that I'm actually doing. And at the end of the day, also, I can scan any of the products into the digitized record on my phone to say what's going on. And I can do that on Mrs. Miggins' rear extension. Mrs. Miggins' rear extension is getting a lot of publicity at the moment, but it's going to be one of the best built extensions in the UK. But you will know what products were actually used and delivered there. One of the shocks that came out of Grenfell was we didn't even know what fire doors, what insulation materials, etc., had actually been installed in there. We had to then go around and survey all of these buildings to try and find out what had been put on them. Surely to goodness, with something as simple as an iPhone, we can get digitized records simply. And again, going back to the points, I think it was last week or the week before, we had glazing panels, we had parts of the external fabric of our buildings falling off in central London, right? It's not just about fire safety. We've got issues with those aspects as well. We've got to deliver quality across all of these issues.
I'm just going to have to speed up the process. We've not got very long left in this panel. There's probably another 1,000 questions we could answer on fire. But Duncan, perhaps we'll start with you on this one. As testing and certification can be completed on projects to ensure things are better from a fire point of view and requirements are met. But what are your thoughts on testing and certification?
I think when I first started doing fire stopping, it was always portrayed as this black art. People went away and did ad hoc testing, and the perception was, well, if it worked on in one application, it would do everything. It'd be universal, which couldn't be further from the truth. Sort of coming back to the golden thread thing a little bit, one of the things I've been sitting on BIM for housing and identifying the essential characteristics of all these different cavity barriers, fire stops, etc. And that one of the things that comes up in the Hackett is that manufacturers haven't been as open, if you like, about what data they have, and more importantly, what didn't work. So you can present your fire test evidence, but you wouldn't necessarily get a fire test report on something that didn't work. So it's having that balance. So in terms of certification, people are still using BS 476 indicative testing. There is no control on the source of those materials. So actually you could turn up to a fire test with an R&D sample. There is no policing of factory production controls or anything else. What we have done, we've actually followed for all of our products a CE marked route, which will then turn into a UKCA. And the backbone of that is actually factory production control. Before you do any testing, UL or a third party body will come in, they will look at your products, they will chemically and physically fingerprint them. They then do the factory production control, and stuff is sampled by the third party. It is then sent away for testing, whether it's fire, thermal, or anything else. So you have a chain of custody from day one right the way through to the guy using the thing on site. So you know the product you've used is the one that's been tested. And what it will also do, a European technical approval is produced, which gives you the scope of use of that product. So you just haven't got these linear points. You've actually got scope, which actually gives you the full picture of where these products can be used. And traditionally, people have made up EJs with the barest, the actually thinnest of test evidence, which really winds me up, to be perfectly honest, because, again, it comes down to cost a lot of the time. They are doing the bare minimum to try and get a sale from a manufacturer's point of view. And you need this accountability. That's what you need. With that goes, obviously, with the golden thread from design to subcontractors. Again, we're actually producing CITB training course for installation of our products. So we know that people are competent to a degree. And then the maintenance records of these products then goes on to the building owner. And that's part of the CE marking UK process as well. So that actually, as we were saying earlier, with household management, the guy who's in the building, who's looking after it, with all the people occupying it, can keep that building safe, and that is absolute paramount to me.
Nada, we perhaps finish with you. Perhaps could you give us a bit of guidance on the using testing, but also not being so dependent on testing, because obviously we've seen in Grenfell certain test scenarios which were never realistic either, as well, in practical use. But what do Wintec, how do they approach this point?
So as facade consultants, facades is not just fire, and testing just doesn't include fire, it includes everything. Just to go back on that a bit, facade engineering is at the cusp of an industry where it marries what the architect wants and how it can be built and how it can perform. Cladding is usually the most expensive part of the building. It's also the most risky part of the building. So as much as a well-designed facade is obvious, so is a poor one. So in terms of testing, there are two folds, isn't it, in any design? It's design phase, which we all tend to do a very good job. And then the construction phase, which is where things can go wrong if not properly monitored. So in terms of testing during the design phase is great because we get a lot of product data sheets. We have a look at the test certificates, and we need to be mindful that most of the test is for standardized systems. Every building has its own design, which means whether the test data is applicable to it or not is something that a competent engineer should look into. At the same time, I think it's quite sensible to note that everything cannot be tested for every project because of the cost factor. So I think we need to see what the test data includes and what is it on the building and how we can cross that bridge. There are cases where it's drastically different and we decline to approve the product. There are cases where it's there and we might need extra support from building insurers or building control to see what they think and whether they feel that this would suit. So as facade consultants, we use the knowledge that we have, not only what we have learned, but also from other projects that we have seen in the industry and from experience of dealing with other consultants. So in terms of testing, design phase, most of it gets approved because you feel that it looks good and fine. The details work, the certificates work. When you go on site, sometimes some things happen on site that changes the design and they change the way it's installed. And that's where we come in. We go on site, we have a look, and then we say, this is not what was tested or approved, and it has to change, or you need to go back to the drawing board and get it approved again. So those are the kind of work that a facade consultant would normally do on all aspects, not just fire stopping or cavity barriers. This includes everything from windows to glass to any aspect of cladding, balconies, facades, anything. And I'm sure the same goes for any other profession, any other discipline within this industry. So yes, we do look at testing in the design phase, but I think it's very important, as this panel has discussed, that we remember what we approved during the design phase and make sure that's what's been installed later on, and that carries on till the end. Sometimes supply issues, the product is totally changed. When we go out for site visits, we see that the product has changed and there's no approval. They say, oh, it's a similar testing, similar product. It's just the manufacturer is different. And we're like, no, we still need to go through the process because there might be things that we're not aware of. So I think we need to be mindful. We need to be conscious, and we need to make sure everything is documented. And I think that comes back to your maintenance manual, what product has been used, whether 5-10 years later, what we're doing now is we're going back to old buildings and surveying it. To look at what's been installed. And you're absolutely right. We don't know what product has been installed. There's no information. There's no way to check it. There's no manufacturer marking. We don't know. Apart from the fact that, when you send it for testing, whether it's combustible or not, which doesn't help in most cases.
So thanks for your summary. We are in stoppage time now, but
just very quickly, the fire occurred in Melbourne, the Lacrosse building in Melbourne, which was a full height facade burn. Afterwards, when the fire was out, they took the panels off, and this was in 2015, I think, from memory, and they were all counterfeit. So they had all the markings on, all the manufacturer's markings on, but they were all counterfeit. We don't know the scale of counterfeit products out there at the moment, but there's various issues to do with, as I say, counterfeit products on the market. So that's just another issue to be aware of.
Sure. Well, if we can perhaps have a couple of words from each on kind of what your key takeaway would be for the audience today. Russ, if you want to start us off.
Blatant plug then, if I may, for our conference for next year. It's in May of next year, the 7th International Tall Building Fire Safety Conference. It's 3 days. We've now confirmed we've got speakers coming around the world to talk about facades, talk about tall timber. We're talking about PEEPs and other issues to do with fire risk management, building and firefighters. So thank you for the plug. If anybody wants to know, come and see me afterwards. What's the thing I would say? We now do training for most of the big building providers in the country, and I could reel off a list of names, but that bit over there, Battersea, Canary Wharf, etc. And it is absolutely clear to me now, and I have studied over 100 tall building fires historically around the world. Management is the key component to the successful running of that building and reducing fire risk to an acceptable level. And we can, to a certain extent, become obsessive about the structure and element, and we should get that absolutely right. I'm not saying that, but architects and all the stakeholders in this have to think about how that building is going to be managed. And also, now we're talking about this new lifestyle of balcony living. We've now, with under the Fire Safety Act, the fire risk assessors now have to include the external envelope, and they have to include balconies. What's not clear from that is what happens when we start putting an imposed load on that balcony. If I've got a 20-story building with stacked balconies, and 4 or 5 of those people are abusing those balconies, what are we going to do about that? And that opens up whole issues about the management of the building and how we challenge people who are living potentially dangerous lifestyles that are putting the rest of the people's lives at risk. So there's some questions there that I think we do have to address, because currently, if you're a fire officer, it's very difficult for a fire officer to go into a private dwelling, to cross that threshold. if people are doing hoarding, for example, real big issue, cramming, over occupancy of buildings. We know that's happening all around the world where we've got flats designed for 4 and 6 people with 30 people in them. Because if you live in Canary Wharf, who's making the coffee and doing all those low-skilled wards? Well, they're cramming. And as a fire engineer, I'm designing that building for 800 people. They've had cases in America where they've had 3,000 people in that building. All the staircases are under provision. So there are some broader issues about the lifetime of the building. This is not just a sterile discussion about design and systems and buildings and components, etc. Let's think about how the building is going to be used for 25 years and how it's going to be managed. Thank you.
Right. Sorry,
Okay,
Jeff.
Very, very briefly on the test certificates. If you're looking at a test certificate, check out the validity and any conditions in relation to it, and what authority the organisation had in the first instance to issue that certificate, because there are certificates out there that are put together as glorified manufacturer's literature, and that's something that particularly frustrates me. So it should actually be a proper test certificate, not manufacturer's claims. I think that the industry has to still go through this culture change. We need to, as an industry, put in those 3 points, each one of those gateways, and we need to have that across the board. It's not just about fire safety either. And I think that's one of the real positives about the book. So I'm going to give you a plug for your book right now, that what you've got in there is you've got industry-wide 360 looking at all of these different issues. It's not just about fire safety. And yes, we have to solve fire safety, but it's a much wider issue about culture and about compliance throughout the whole of that. And in my opinion, the way forward with that is 1, to have a proper enforcement process, and 2, a proper record process, and that will involve AI and technology moving forward.
Thank you very much. Nick?
I think for me, it's about trying to future-proof. I know none of us got crystal balls, but 20 years ago, no one knew about Airbnb and stuff like that, and now people are being, how our buildings are being used. And I think it's a little bit about think about people when you're designing and building. People do funny things. They do, and this is what we're talking about in the residential. Said these are people's homes, and we want them to be there. So think about what they could do, enclosed balconies when they're not meant to be. So try and think of that. And of course, I've got to plug firefighter safety. It's important that you make buildings safe for firefighters. When things go wrong, because we are the people who do turn up. So think very much around. I've always said that it's B1 to B5, and B5 is the last resort. I think it should be the other way around. Think about B5 first, and then I would say that being a firefighter, but that's for me the 2 things. Think about people that are going to live and resort and do in your buildings, and think about firefighter safety.
Thanks. Nada?
Well, there's a lot more to be done in the industry. I think we have been doing quite a bit. And I think each one has a responsibility to bring it out into the industry and share that information, so everybody can learn off it and keep developing it. So I think we all have a responsibility in this, whether it's the architect, whether it's a structural engineer, fire, facades, services, anybody. When you do stuff, when you do a design that's feeding into the sustainability or efficiency or anything for that matter, I think we have a responsibility to put it out there, so others can learn from it and others can use it to develop the industry further. And I think that's the takeaway from this, that whatever you do, we think of the greater costs and look outward rather than inward, and develop the industry a lot more.
Thank you very much. Duncan?
I think really, just very briefly, I think the cascade of information from the design right through to the maintenance is really important. Where you can, use either a third-party certificated product because it's been audited from day one through to actually coming onto your site. Use competent tradespeople within the fire stopping fraternity. There are third-party accredited installers who should have that competency to record everything and pass that on as an O&M to the actual people who are living in that building at a later date.
Certainly from our point of view, I think 2 summaries really is engage early, and engage early with people which you can trust. So look for ethics and so on in that. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. And the next panel discussion is about 10 minutes in this room again. So thank you very much for your time, everyone.
Thank you.